The architecture of international relations in the Middle East has long been defined by a set of rigid, albeit unwritten, rules of engagement. For nearly half a century, the adversarial dance between Washington and Tehran has operated within a framework of specific, hard security thresholds. These traditional red lines have almost exclusively revolved around existential or geopolitical threats. The potential development of a nuclear arsenal, the disruption of maritime commerce through the critical choke point of the Strait of Hormuz, or direct kinetic attacks on American personnel and military assets stationed in the region. The internal governance of the Islamic Republic, specifically the treatment of its own citizenry, was historically relegated to the domain of diplomatic condemnation, economic sanctions, and international censure. However, the recent disclosure by United States officials to the New York Times regarding a potential military strike aimed at sending a message to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei regarding the lethal crackdown on protesters marks a profound and volatile shift in foreign policy doctrine. This revelation signals the militarization of moral policy, a strategic pivot that fundamentally alters the calculus of deterrence and introduces a new, unpredictable variable into an already combustible region. To comprehend the magnitude of this potential shift, one must first deconstruct the evolution of American deterrence strategy. Traditionally, military force is reserved for the protection of physical interests and the defense of sovereignty. By signaling that the internal repression of protesters is now a trigger for external military intervention, the United States is redefining its national security interests to include the domestic stability and human rights landscape of its adversaries. The prevailing logic suggests that a regime willing to slaughter its own population to maintain power is inherently unstable and poses a long-term threat to regional order that cannot be contained by borders. This strategy moves beyond simple deterrence, which seeks to prevent an action, and enters the realm of compellence, seeking to force an adversary to reverse a course of action through the threat of force. However, unlike striking a physical nuclear facility or a radar installation, striking to change the decision-making calculus of a theocratic leader regarding domestic security is an abstract goal with no clear metric for success. It replaces the tangible objectives of warfare with psychological ones, attempting to use high explosives to achieve a behavioral modification. The specific caveat mentioned in the leaked report, that the strike is not intended to lead to a direct overthrow of the government, is perhaps the most critical component of this strategic messaging. This detail was likely not leaked by accident. It represents a calculated attempt to construct a diplomatic off-ramp before the conflict even begins. In the psychology of authoritarian leadership, the ultimate imperative is regime survival. If Ayatollah Khamenei perceives that an American strike is the opening salvo of a comprehensive regime change operation, he will have no incentive to show restraint. Under such a perception, the leadership in Tehran would likely view the situation as existential, unleashing its full arsenal of ballistic missiles and activating every proxy network across the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula in a fight for survival. By publicly and explicitly stating that the leadership structure itself is not the target, Washington is attempting to thread a strategic needle, inflicting enough pain to halt the crackdown on protesters while simultaneously reassuring the Iranian security apparatus that their existence is not in immediate jeopardy. This carefully calibrated assurance is also directed at American allies in the Arabian Gulf. Nations such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar are geographically located on the front lines of any potential conflict with Iran. While these nations desire a contained and weakened Iran, they are terrified of a chaotic, headless state or a total war that would devastate their energy infrastructure and economic ambitions. The promise that this is a limited engagement is designed to maintain the cohesion of the anti-Iran coalition, ensuring that Gulf states do not fracture from the alliance out of fear of getting dragged into a catastrophic regional conflagration. It serves as a guarantee that the United States is not seeking to create a power vacuum in Tehran that could lead to widespread instability, similar to the aftermath of previous interventions in the region. However, the operational reality of such a strike presents immense tactical challenges and high risks of unintended consequences. To effectively send a message regarding the protesters, the United States would need to target the specific infrastructure of the repression apparatus. This would likely include command and control centers of the Basij militia, communication hubs used to coordinate the crackdown, or barracks of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The difficulty lies in the fact that these facilities are often embedded deep within dense urban centers, surrounded by the very civilian populations the United States claims to be protecting. A missile strike that results in significant collateral damage would immediately backfire. Instead of protecting the protesters, the United States would be accused of harming the very people it claims to support, handing the regime a powerful propaganda victory and potentially turning the sentiment of the street against external interference. This leads to the escalation trap, a scenario where the initial action triggers a chain reaction that spirals out of control. The American assumption relies on the idea that Iran will act as a rational actor, accepting a limited strike as a penalty and subsequently de-escalating to avoid further damage. History in the region suggests this is a dangerous miscalculation. A direct military attack on Iranian soil would likely trigger a rally around the flag effect. The supreme leader could utilize the airstrikes to delegitimize the protest movement, branding the demonstrators not as dissatisfied citizens, but as foot soldiers for a foreign aggressor. This would allow the regime to justify even harsher measures under the guise of national defense, alienating the moderate middle class from the protest movement and solidifying the loyalty of hardline factions who view the West as an implacable enemy. Furthermore, Iran possesses a robust and sophisticated capability for asymmetric retaliation. Tehran is unlikely to respond by challenging the United States Air Force directly in the skies. Instead, they would likely activate their extensive proxy networks across the region. This could manifest as rocket attacks on Israel by Hezbollah, drone strikes on Saudi oil facilities by Houthi rebels, or kinetic targeting of American bases in Iraq and Syria. Such a response would force the United States to retaliate further, initiating a cycle of tit-for-tat exchanges that would quickly render the initial promise of a limited strike obsolete. The ghost of the 2020 strike that eliminated General Qasem Soleimani looms large over this analysis. While that strike established a form of deterrence, it also pushed the two nations to the brink of open warfare. A strike on Iranian soil would be viewed as an even greater provocation, potentially crossing a threshold from which there is no return. From a geopolitical perspective, this move would face fierce opposition from global power competitors. Russia and China would view a strike based on human rights justifications as a direct violation of national sovereignty and a dangerous precedent that undermines the principles of the international order. Moscow could exploit the situation to deepen its military alliance with Tehran, potentially supplying advanced air defense systems or sharing intelligence to complicate American operations. This would further align the interests of revisionist powers against the United States. Meanwhile, European allies, while sympathetic to the human rights cause, generally fear military escalation that could lead to a new migration crisis or energy instability. A unilateral American strike could fracture the transatlantic consensus on dealing with Iran, isolating Washington at a time when unity is essential. The economic implications of such a strategy cannot be ignored. The mere threat of kinetic action in the Persian Gulf introduces a risk premium into global energy markets. If the conflict escalates to involve shipping lanes or energy infrastructure, the global economy could face a significant shock. Iran has long threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz in the event of war, a move that would choke off a significant portion of the world's oil supply. Even a partial disruption could lead to skyrocketing energy prices, fueling inflation and economic instability across the globe. This economic leverage is a key component of Iran's deterrence strategy, and any American military planning must account for the potential economic fallout of a strike. Ultimately, the leak of this potential operation reveals a deep frustration within the American administration regarding the limitations of economic and diplomatic pressure. It signifies a willingness to embrace high-risk options in an attempt to break the stalemate. However, using kinetic force to achieve a soft political outcome is a gamble with historically low success rates. The United States is signaling that it is willing to cross a Rubicon, transforming the defense of human rights from a diplomatic ideal into a casus belli. While this may provide a morale boost to the protesters on the streets of Tehran, it places the entire region on a knife edge. The distance between a strike intended to send a message and a strike that ignites a regional conflagration is measured in inches. And once the first missile is launched, the trajectory of the conflict is no longer under the control of the White House. The strategy relies on the enemy behaving predictably, a luxury that warfare rarely affords. The use of military force is a blunt instrument, ill-suited for the delicate task of influencing the internal political dynamics of a complex and resilient adversary. In conclusion, the proposed strategy of a limited strike represents a high-stakes test of American resolve and capability. It attempts to balance the moral imperative to protect human rights with the strategic necessity of avoiding total war. Yet, the inherent contradictions of the plan, attacking a nation to stop repression without seeking to remove the repressors, create a fragile framework that could easily collapse under the weight of combat. As tensions mount, the world watches to see if this new red line will deter the crackdowns or if it will serve as the spark for the next great conflict in the Middle East. The path forward is fraught with peril, requiring a level of diplomatic dexterity and military precision that is difficult to maintain in the fog of crisis. The decision to leak this information is itself a weapon, a form of psychological warfare designed to force a change in behavior without firing a shot. But if that bluff is called, the consequences will be real, irreversible, and potentially catastrophic.